Hello everyone. Today we are going to take a little ride down the road until I find something that I want to paint. I've got all my gear in the bags. I'm wearing my Etchr in backpack mode. So yeah, we're ready to go. Just gonna see what inspires me today. I was really inspired by the autumn colors, so I used it as an opportunity to paint my Patreon bonus tutorial for the month before heading back out when the light was lower in the sky. It's time for attempt number 2. The sun is much lower in the sky now, so hopefully it won't be so blinding. At this point, I was feeling a cocktail of emotions. Everything from super inspired to apprehensive to excited to nervous. I was a little bit overwhelmed by the wind and the traffic noise behind me and knowing that the sun was gonna set pretty soon. Got my travel brushes today. Don't remember which ones I brought. Nothing very big, so I'm probably gonna cut my paper in half. Dividing my paper into 4 sections was one of the best decisions. It meant that I could work a little bit quicker on smaller pieces and try different compositions as well as color combinations. Oh, I have another one. Yes, a big one. That's a relief. Yeah, no, I think it's good to do 4 because it's going to change quick and I can use that for like quick color notes. Okay. So actually, it definitely is ideal. So one of the reasons I decided to edit the video that way is because that's exactly how it felt. That first layer felt so crazy and rushed and energetic. The paper was taking a long time to dry, so a lot of my colors were bleeding into each other, and that in a way made it a bit more chaotic. But then as I was finishing the 4th composition, I thought, well, this is kind of good because now I can rest for a second and really take in the environment before doing the next layer. just a quick reminder to like the video if you're enjoying it, which lets me know to make more like this in the future. One thing I realized is that in doing 3 or 4 versions of the same scene, I start to notice that I'm doing patterns. So for instance, the long horizontal shadows across the green field became very obviously repeated. And so I knew that in the final piece at home, I would carry that forward and emphasize that. I also noticed a few color combinations that I would gravitate towards, so I would definitely be experimenting with those back home. When I'm done and I'm packing up, I'm not doing it mindlessly. I'm thinking about my compositions, my colors. I'm also trying to soak in the last bit of light and really capture that feeling of being there, because that's really important back in the studio. I can look at references, both photo and video, but I really need to hold on to how it felt to be there. The sense of light that is pouring through the valley. That's what I really want to capture. Now, typically I like to paint the scene soon after I arrive back home because everything is fresh in my mind, but I ended up getting distracted by cats and then chasing the aurora, which I'll just share another time. So the next morning I got to work. I use photos and videos to refresh my memory, and I also look at the paintings I did on location. And I try to sit in the memories and really bring them back to life before I start painting. When I sit down to paint this again in the studio, I'm looking at my color notes from outside, and I'm picking out little pieces of each one that I think work, and also noticing things that don't work so that I don't repeat it again. So I can already see a few things that are standing out, and one of those is the difference between the backgrounds. The first one is always well, I wouldn't say always, but typically the first one is the worst in terms of accuracy because I think my eyes are still adjusting. And then as I move into the next ones, I usually can see a bit more. I'm a bit more sensitive to the light and the colors and the grays. So this background, I think, definitely works better. There's a nice shift of like a warm gray, very, very light, into a cooler gray. And I think that conveys the sense of light from behind the mountains over here. And I think this one does a good job with that as well. It was a bit more exaggerated with the warm light coming through, and then the much cooler hills here. And this one is quite similar to this one, except there's maybe a bigger shift between the values from here to here. So I want to kind of play with something between these three. I also like the shapes that I have going on here. This one is okay in some areas, but they're a bit too muddled, too blended, whereas this one I have some stronger vertical shapes. sort of conveying the trees and the shrubs that were in the fields, causing all these long shadows, and I really like that. So maybe something between like this and this for those shapes. And in terms of color of the field, I think this one is the most real, the one that looks more like the references. And from what I remember, like the warmth of that lighter green comes through a bit more than these do. And then maybe the shadows are a bit too green, so I could play with a combination of this and this for the shadows. For the trees on the left, I don't like any of these, so I think I'll do a couple tests and kind of work on that a little bit more. But I think the water is most successful in this one, which has a bit of reflection, a bit of movement, but I think it needs to be darker. So yeah, those are the key things I'm going to be thinking about when I paint it again. I'm using gouache, which is an opaque medium, but it can be diluted with water to get kind of like a watercolor effect. So usually my first layer is very wet. I let things bleed and flow, and I really like balancing this softness with some of the harder lines and edges that I'm going to use later on. So one of the differences between my piece outside and what I'm doing in the studio here is that in the sky and the river, I'm using a bit more water and a bit more softness. This is something that I was thinking about when I was outside, but it was a little trickier because I was working so quickly and I realized how long it would take the paper to dry. I ended up not being able to use quite as much water and get this softness that I was going for. I mean, that's kind of an excuse because I could have taken a little bit longer, but because the sun was setting, I didn't quite know how long I had, and so I was working very, very quickly, especially in that first layer. After that first layer, I remember thinking, okay, now I can calm down a little and work a little bit slower. But yeah, you know, when you're just in the moment out there, things happen quick and I just respond. So anyways, back to this painting. I'm just going to use my dryer to speed up the dry time so that I can then move on to the second layer. I honestly think the two most important things to capture the sense of light that I saw outside is the distant hills, the distant mountains, the color and value of those, and the long shadows falling across the field. I knew that if I could capture those two things correctly, the rest would fall into place. It would all make sense. In the end, you'll have to decide whether I did that or not, but while I was in this section of the painting, I was still kind of in more of a hesitation mode, or I was working very slowly. I was using my little test sheet of paper to test my colors as I went, and I was using paint rather sparingly. That's something that you can do really easily with gouache. It's one of those opaque mediums that you can just continually layer and layer and layer, so it doesn't really matter. There's not really any stress there. But the only thing that can be tricky about that is if you do put a bit too much down to begin with, all of your consecutive layers on top of that will or could react with it. So it could pick up what's below, and then you could end up with kind of like a muddy mess if you're not careful. But in my first layer, I'm usually using a lot less paint and a bit more water just to get things kind of filled in a little. I think it's really helpful to remove the white of the paper as quickly as possible, because if you think about it, there's hardly anywhere in any of our landscapes that is going to be pure white. Maybe a flower or something reflecting off of something. It could be, you know, a tiny little area in the painting, but for the most part, there's no pure white. So the fact that we're staring at a pure white piece of paper for for the beginning of the painting, it can be very distracting, and it can trick your eye into seeing different values and colors. So again, getting rid of that white of the paper as quickly as we can is a great strategy. And then once you have kind of a base layer, you can just build on top of that, and you can make better decisions. At least I think I do. I make better decisions about color and value in comparison to what's already on the paper. So if your first layer or even second layer looks like a hot mess, if it looks absolutely horrible, don't worry, that is completely normal. Call it the ugly phase, call it whatever you want. Just know that it happens, and it's actually a good thing to have something like that so that you can build on top of it. Sometimes it's easy to forget when painting a landscape that there's so much detail that we don't need to paint. There's leaves and trees and rocks and so many things we can see, but does it really serve the painting? Since my style kind of bridges the abstract and representational worlds, I'm always asking myself, what are the fewest amount of brushstrokes to get my point across? I find that it forces me to be a little bit more creative with how I use my brush and how I minimize detail. But I think it's normal for us to want to render something to death. We want to add in all of the details we see because we see them and we think they're supposed to be in there. So taking my time in the studio like this and really reassessing what's important, I think helps me become a better artist, or at least get closer to my own goals. I mean, this painting isn't about the autumn colors or the moving water. It's about the sense of light moving through the valley. So I knew that as long as I could capture that, everything else was a bonus. I do think my final piece is much more successful than any of the pieces I did outside, which is kind of the point. Painting outside, for me at least, is not about creating a final piece, a masterpiece, anything that's going to hang on a wall. It's much more about experiencing the beauty of nature, being in gorgeous places in beautiful light, and just being inspired, communing with nature. I draw so much energy and motivation from being outside, and that's really what I try to pour into my artwork. And I'm always striving to improve my skills, so being able to critique my work objectively, which requires a lot of discipline and repetition. But the great thing about painting these beautiful scenes again is that it brings me right back to that bridge in the beautiful golden light. I hope you enjoyed coming along with me and hearing about my lessons learned. I have a whole playlist for this series where I take you outside and then talk about the lessons and paint again in the studio. So I'll leave that link in the description. In the meantime, if you would like some more tutorial-based videos, I have tons of them over on my Patreon. So I'll leave a link for that as well. Thank you all, and I'll see you again soon. Take care.